Nigerians are still dissecting and digesting the events of the presidential elections. Opposition parties have taken their challenges of the results to court. But while Africa's largest economy and most populous black country awaits the results of various petitions, conversations have been varied, with the Department of State Services telling Nigerians some days ago that it has credible evidence of people working to bring about an interim government in Nigeria. There have been protests for and against not just the conduct of the elections, but also the eventual results. This weekend, an audio of a conversation supposedly between the Labour Party's presidential candidate Peter Obi and a religious leader in Nigeria was released. Catch Ononoju, special advisor on public affairs to the Labour Party presidential candidate, denied that the audio was real and said that it was a deep fake meant to distract the party from pursuing its case in the courts. But the conversation around the contestation of results has taken a new turn after Nigeria's Minister of Information and Communication, Lai Mohammed, warned Peter Obi against inciting violence over the outcome of the presidential election. He accused Obi and his running mate, Datti Ahmed, of treason and insurrection. Peter Obi has responded, describing the allegations as malicious and fictitious. Joining me right now is Jide Ologun, legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, and we hope that our second guest will also be able to join us in the course of the show. Mr. Ologun, welcome to Politics HQ. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you also.
So let's start with these heavy words that we are hearing from the Minister of Information and Communication: treason and insurrection. Those are not words that should be thrown away or thrown around very carelessly. We've seen tensions rise in the past few weeks since the presidential elections. Let's start with an idea of the sentiment and the atmosphere. Are you surprised that we've gotten to this point where treason is being mentioned, where we're hearing from the DSS that it has credible claims of people planning to impose an interim government on Nigerians?
When you take treason as a word, it means the crime of attacking a state authority to which you owe your allegiance, or supporting the enemy of the state against the state. And what is being claimed here by the minister on behalf of the Federal Republic of Nigeria is that the utterances of the Labour Party vice presidential candidate at the last poll, that, saying that the Supreme Court must probably dance to their own tunes, and that the president-elect, they should not be sworn into office, when by virtue of the Constitution, INEC is the umpire mandated to manage the elections of the country. And there is a provision in the ecosystem of our electioneering processes that if you are not satisfied with the final verdict of INEC, then go to court. So these statements have been perceived by the state as trying to incite the people against the state and dictate to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land since 1963. So I think this is where we are coming from. And like I said, it's a very serious crime. But at this point in time, they may just be mere allegations. And that is why Peter Obi has responded that there is a need to substantiate this allegation. But I can let you know that for those who are in the camp of Peter Obi, we need to understudy the government very well and try to realize that the government also has a responsibility to prevent the nation from going into chaos. And that is why one of the comments of the minister, Lai Mohammed, is that if you have submitted your party's interest to the judicial process through the election tribunal, then why are you making all these comments again? Because that provision is there. And in the case of insurrection, like inciting the people against the state, and of course, the state needs to be proactive in ensuring that we don't have that crisis in our hands. And if you link the statement that was made on the media platform, and that platform had been sanctioned, and you combine it with the leaked conversation between Peter Obi and one of the prominent clerics in the nation, then you realize that there may be a need for caution in how some of the candidates are going about seeking justice in court in respect of the last election. And don't forget also that at a point in time, even a chieftain of APC came out to insinuate that some may be, gunning towards planning a coup, whatever, and he was invited by DSS. And lately, DSS has cautioned those who are trying to put in place an interim government. So this is a very sensitive time for Nigeria now, and the advice we can just give is that if there is a judicial process that has been incorporated into the electioneering ecosystem, let's submit to it and be careful about the statements that we make. Because when you talk about treason, anyone who has committed treason is known in law as a traitor. And I don't think any of the candidates during the last general elections will want to be treated as a traitor.
Okay.
And those are mine, just at this point.
So your opening comments are well noted, and just, of course, for the conversation, we did speak to a representative of the Labour Party and Peter Obi, and they've denied that that audio is a real audio, saying that it's a deep fake meant to distract not just the party, but also Nigerians. So also joining me now, Deji Ajare. He's the Executive Director of the Sterling Law Center. Mr. Ajare, welcome to the show. Laying an opening foundation around this conversation happening now around treason, I want to look specifically at what Lai Mohammed is quoted as saying. And he apparently is on a tour in the United States, has met media organizations, and he's quoted as saying this: Obi and his vice, Datti Ahmed, cannot be threatening Nigerians that if the president-elect, Bola Tinubu of the All Progressives Congress, is sworn in on May 29th, it will be the end of democracy in Nigeria. This is treason. You cannot be inviting insurrection, and this is what they're doing. Obi's statement is that of a desperate person. He is not the Democrat that he claimed to be. A Democrat should not believe in democracy only when he wins, end quote. So if we start with just the beginning of that statement, where he talks about Obi and his vice threatening Nigerians that if the president-elect is sworn in, then that means the end of democracy. When you look at that statement on its own, do you think that statement meets up to the standards of being considered a treasonable statement, a statement that is looking to incite people to insurrection?
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening again. I'll be very, very honest with you, I have tried to over and over listen to the video that that the minister referenced, where the vice presidential candidate of the Labour Party in the last election said if His Excellency Alhaji Bola Tinubu is sworn in on May 29th, would be the end of democracy or the death of democracy. And matter of fact is, I am unable to agree that it is a treasonable statement. Look, it is elections, it is politics, and it is not unusual for politicians to use rhetorics and propaganda during elections. In fact, it is quite common for politicians to use such strong, emotional, and persuasive languages to appeal to gain support from the electorate, from the citizenry. And these techniques sometimes includes exaggerations, name calling, appeals to fear or to patriotism sometimes. But politicians have been known to use these tactics for centuries as a way to manipulate public opinion and win elections. Of course, it is for the voters to demonstrate strong awareness of these tactics and carefully evaluate the information they are presented in order to make informed decisions. But treason is an act of betraying one's country or government, so typically by intentionally collaborating with an enemy during a time of war or engaging in acts that aim to overthrow or undermine the government. Of course, it is a serious offense, and I don't think the statements that were attributed to Datti really should be regarded as treasonable statements in that context. It was, to the best of my knowledge, such statements have been made even by some of the members of the APC who are currently in government in the periods preceding the 2015 elections, and even thereafter, there were quite a lot of statements that were even more incendiary in nature than the statements that is. I think perhaps the propaganda is just coming from both sides. both on the part of the Labour Party, and the APC is probably just capitalizing on that statement to, probably prepare grounds for, some sort of suppression, in my opinion. That's what it looks like.
Okay, so Mr. Ologun, I want to go back to something you said, and that was around the Supreme Court. We've been following, I guess we'd say, protests and rallies. Let's use the languages now. Protests and rallies for and against the election results, some supporting INEC, some not supporting INEC. But interestingly enough, there are some of the protesters who have said that there are attempts to intimidate the Supreme Court of Nigeria when it comes to possibly having one of the petitions reach all the way up to the Supreme Court. Do you think it's even possible to intimidate the Supreme Court? Because again, both of you have mentioned issues around rhetoric and the language used by not now just politicians, but those who've inserted themselves into the ongoing controversies around the elections. Is it even possible to really intimidate the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land for Nigeria?
The Supreme Court, I know, cannot be intimidated, and that is a fact. It's been the highest court in the land since 1963. And let's use the very recent case we have in the country, talking about the Naira swap, the descent of the Naira, when the state went to the Supreme Court as the court of first and final jurisdiction of matters between states and the Federation. And several arguments came that could have intimidated the Supreme Court that, CBN is not a party to the case, your decision cannot be binding on central bank. But the 7-man panel said, this is our position, let these old currencies return to circulation. And when the president weighed the decision, as against his earlier absorption of office by saying only 200 Naira should return to circulation, he had to throw in the towel. And of course, he pushed it to the Attorney General and the governor of central bank that he has not at any point in time instructed them to disobey the decision of the Supreme Court. And by the way, when you start your case at the election tribunal, if you are not satisfied with the decision there, you proceed to the appellate level, the appeal court. And if you are not satisfied, you proceed to the Supreme Court. And we have the instant case of Osun State now. The tribunal took a decision, though not unanimous, that the victory of Adeleke be upturned. And the matter proceeded to Court of Appeal, and Court of Appeal said no, that it should be confirmed as the governor-elect. And we are now waiting to see if the former governor will proceed to the Supreme Court or not. So I do not see the Supreme Court being intimidated in this matter. I've always said this, but it may not go down with many, that it's all about how you present your case. And that is the power of litigation. You don't expect that somebody should come and prove your case for you. And that is why when you talk about the criminal justice value chain, you talk about 3 important pillars, which is number 1, thorough investigation, number 2, diligent prosecution, and number 3, a committed judiciary. And I've heard several say that the judiciary cannot be trusted. I don't want to key into that template. You see, what we can all do is to ensure that if we have laid down grievance procedures, let's respect it. And like my colleague rightly mentioned here, all these political parties should realize that there are procedures. They all signed to the peace accord before these elections. And election presupposes that somebody will win. And that's one of the points that the state is clearly rolling out now, that please, you need to, when you're signing the peace accord, was it that if I don't win, then heaven should be let loose? And this is the democratic aspect of the whole process. So I do not see the judiciary being intimidated. And that is, of course, why you have the 3 levels of interventions, particularly in case of this presidential election and governorship election, that if you are not satisfied with the decision of the tribunal, you proceed to the Court of Appeal, and if you are not satisfied, you go to the Supreme Court. And after the Supreme Court, that is the final point of verdict. And let me also say this, that, talking about interpreting statements, and it's at the discretion of the state. It will be, I mean, it is what, and if you go down history, many people have been apprehended. You know, some of the statements of some Nigerians that some people never thought could lead them to where they are today were taken as light statements. And what we are asking for is that please, as we approach elections, even when we are not satisfied with the outcome of what the processes, let us engage the legitimate channels that have been put in place. Because when you talk about inciting the people, how are you going to control the people? You can see what is going on in the USA now. The former president of America, Donald Trump, is being arraigned in New York City. You know, at a time during the last elections, he incited the people to, roll out an attack on the Capitol, and the system frowned so much on it. So we need to be proactive. We need to be proactive. Yeah, I mean, majority are in the school of thought that there were many complaints about these last elections. But cutting off the head is not the solution to headache. And that is why we are also appealing generally that we should please engage these issues in very proactive manner and, of course, peaceful manner. And those are my submissions for now. But I said it somewhere also, if parties do not approach the judiciary will not impose anything on anybody. If the state governors did not go to Supreme Court in respect of the Naira swap case, Supreme Court would have been watching. Well, they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court intervened, and we can see now that the hardship unleashed on the citizens are easing out because of that judicial intervention. And that is why we have the three arms of government, talking about the legislative arms, judiciary, and
the executive.
All right. Exactly. So that we have separations of power, and we have a symbiotic relationship to ensure good governance in the land.
And checks and balances. Okay, Mr. Ajare, I want to come to you now because this statement about treason, or this accusation of treason, is actually being made by the Minister of Information and Communication, Lai Mohammed. But there's also been a conversation around whether or not Lai Mohammed equals the federal government. Does he equal the stance of the Buhari administration on this issue? Is Lai Mohammed saying this equal to us having the Buhari administration saying that they believe that Peter Obi is towing the line of treason? What do you think?
Well, Alhaji Lai Mohammed is the Minister of Information. Presumably, he is the mouthpiece of the federal government, as it is. And so, it's presumably, when he speaks for the federal government. Of course, if it is not so, one would expect him to specifically identify that this, whatever it is he is saying, or whatever statements or position he's taken, and not that of the federal government, but that of himself in his personal capacity. But I think I'm very glad, that we are introducing words, variations of these things. And I would rather want to look at the statement credited to Datti more as incitement, and not less of treason and more of an incitement. And so, if at all the government, the federal government, is interested in taking any steps to stop such inflammatory and incendiary statements, yes, they should address, the choice of words are very, very, very important here, especially given the circumstance, the context in which these issues are coming up, the politics of it, the complaints, the feeling that some people have that they've been rigged out of the election. It's important. So you don't put treason where you should put incitement, and there are two different offenses. You check our law books, you find that, look, the definition of those offenses are separate and different. The punishments meted out for the two offenses are also separate and different. And so, for me, when Alhaji Mohammed speaks, he should speak with some sort of introspection as a minister, one of the Federal Republic, and then as a mouthpiece of the federal government, particularly when he's speaking on an international platform. It's important that the government does not also lend itself to suggestions of unfairness. So, for me, if the President of the Federal Republic has not come out specifically to also say, no, this is not our position on this issue, then of course it is the federal government's position. And while I agree with my learned colleagues that it is the prerogative of the state to determine what is treasonable or what is inciting. But then again, he has also gone ahead to also tell us, you see, it is not for the executive to sit down in judgment, as the accuser and the prosecution, and then as the judge. So if indeed there are any crimes that have been committed or offenses that have been committed, then of course the appropriate things that ought to be done should be done. But then we should also be careful that we don't also concede too much of these powers to the state. Otherwise, we will inadvertently be ceding other rights to them. The right to freedom of expression is a very important right for democratic experience. And so when there is too much, there is excessive monitoring and of
oversight,
speeches, it becomes at the end of the day, or actually now breaches other rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. I am not saying that the right to freedom of speech and expression are absolute, but I am saying it is important that we're careful in conceding the right to this, to the right to eventually look into everything that we say, and also and then start dishing out the punishments for media houses too, because at the end of the day, they play a very important role in stabilizing our democracy, but informing the people, the citizenry, and in conscientizing them. And so if the media starts working under an atmosphere of fear, of intimidation,
self-censorship,
you know that in trouble. Democracy will definitely start to fall.
Okay, so I want to take both of you up on something you've said, because you've sort of taken me into my next question, which is why when I heard Mr. Ologun talk about the discretion of the states when it comes to the issue of terrorism, and you yourself, Mr. Ajare, have talked about it being the prerogative of the state, I would have to ask you, where does the burden to prove terrorism, not terrorism, I beg your pardon, where does the burden to prove treason lie? Because at this point in time, it sounds like someone has shouted fire in a very crowded space. Mr. Ologun, you made mention of the situation in the U.S. currently. Donald Trump being charged with some 34 counts felonies right now. This is stemming partly, not necessarily, the case is involving a former porn star, but it also has some of the elements around the conversation around the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And you said very firmly that the U.S. has frowned on that. It's trying to secure its democracy in the way it knows how. But we have a minister accusing someone of treason. We don't know if there's going to be a case to follow that up. And it just seems to be hanging in the air. It's an accusation no one, whether presidential candidates or even just an ordinary Nigerian, would want to have around their neck. So when it comes to this burden of proving treason, this burden or discretion or prerogative, what do we say about that? How do we leave this hanging in the air if the federal government is not going to take it any further? Should we be expecting, with an accusation such as this, that there should be a furtherance of it, not just something you accuse someone of and leave it in the air? Mr. Ajare, let me start with you.
Well, it is the law is, the position of the law is that he who asserts must prove. And if the federal government is the one alleging that the statements made by Mr. Datti are treasonable, then it is up to the government, the state, to prove that those statements are indeed treasonable, and they can only do so before a properly constituted court of law. Now, the concern one would have, because of the political nature and because of our experiences as a country, really, is that these kind of circumstances, these kind of situations can be leveraged on by politicians to punish or silence their opponents. And it is the reason why it is really important that we as citizens are very, very watchful, very, very careful in following the issues as they arise, and Where it is necessary, we must call out our government to do what is necessary, because it is common knowledge that government, including the current one, they be using the law enforcement instruments of the law enforcement to stifle public conversation, to stifle opposition. We all recall just last year or 2 years ago when the federal government banned Twitter simply because a statement made by the president was flagged by the operators of Twitter. And of course, thankfully, that was the ECOWAS court was eventually condemned, and the government was asked to make a commitment to non-reoccurrence of such. But you see, that is just even a very simple, because at the end of the day, we could say, oh, nobody was really hurt, but people were hurt. But there are cases where people have been hounded, people have been disappeared. And so it would give me, on a personal note, and I think a lot of Nigerians, concerns. And so we would want to be very, very vigilant on this kind of issue.
Okay. Mr. Ologun, I want to hear your thoughts on this. The burden lying with the accuser, in this case, which looks to be the federal government. Is it enough to just make this accusation, as heavy and weighty as it is, without making some movement towards proving it? Just leaving it as saying, we believe the statement to be treasonable, and that's enough. Mr. Ologun, can you hear me? All right.
I can hear you now.
Okay, fantastic.
The question, please.
Okay, so I was asking you that, is it enough to have a representative of the federal government of this administration make an accusation of treason without us seeing some movement towards proving it, some movement beyond just leaving the word hanging? It's like shouting fire in a crowded theater. All right, so I think we may be having some connectivity issues with one of my guests, but this was the question I was going to ask before we went for a break. So we're going to take that break right now. When we come back, wrapping up this aspect of the conversation, but then also looking at another part of the controversy that has stemmed from Minister Lai Mohammed's comments while he's in the United States. And that has to do with the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC's iRev server, and the uploading or lack thereof of the presidential results. That conversation will continue after this. The Minister of Information and Communication, Lai Mohammed's comments on Peter Obi and his accusations of treason have, of course, stirred controversy. But his comments that the Independent National Electoral Commission deliberately withheld uploading the presidential election results have also brought renewed focus to the results, which are now the subject of court cases looking to contest the results. My guest tonight, Deji Ajare, he's the Executive Director at the Sterling Law Center, and legal practitioner and public affairs analyst Jide Ologun are still with me. Now, Mr. Ologun, before we move on to some of the other comments from the minister that seem to be generating controversy, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to my question around the burden of proof and whether it's enough to simply make that accusation without us seeing the federal government make a move on it. It's a very weighty and heavy accusation to make on anyone. And we know that Peter Obi has responded. He has said that it is unfortunate that these consistent efforts to portray me quite contrary to what I am and my core values is coming from such high quarters. He also said Minister Lai accusing me of stoking insurrection is totally malicious and fictitious. I have never discussed or encouraged anyone to undermine the Nigerian state. I have never sponsored or preached any action against the Nigerian state. Those initiating these actions have increasingly used their official positions and agents to make false allegations against me. So in terms of accusation without any further movements, what do you have to say? All right, it seems I'll have to move on, having some connection issues there with Mr. Ologun. So let's move on to other comments that the minister made. The minister also made some comments about the election results, and let's get to those. He's quoted as saying that INEC, suspecting cyber attack, withheld the uploading of the results in order to preserve the integrity of the data. Now, this comes directly as a contradiction of the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, who told Nigerians after the February 25th elections that the failure to upload the results was due to technical glitches and not any form of sabotage or cyber attack. And this has seemingly renewed the fire that those who want to contest the results seem to have had. So, Mr. Ajare, let's look at these comments now. This is directly opposite to what the chairman of INEC told Nigerians. And I asked you and Mr. Ologun earlier that Lai Mohammed equals the federal government. So is this the federal government now saying that this was why INEC, which is meant to be an independent body, did not upload the presidential results, even though we know that there seemingly was no issue with the National Assembly results?
Yes, I had warned earlier that we have to be very careful with politicians. Politicians will do whatever they need to do, and sometimes in so doing, they will create problems both for the country and for themselves. And while I had considered that Minister Lai Mohammed is a spokesperson of the federal government of Nigeria, I do not think he also speaks for INEC, and it is important so that we do not confuse issues there. I do not think INEC reports or gives reports to the minister in order for the minister to come and make a statement on behalf of INEC. And so if INEC had said something that the minister says another and they are in contradiction, then I think we must go with what INEC has said, at least until it is proven otherwise. And as such, now the cases are in court. I think it is best that we wait and see what can be proven in court, to see whether indeed the results were not transmitted because of technical glitches, or if indeed it was a deliberate act. But in any event, if it was deliberate, like the minister had said, I think it would be a very big indictment on both INEC and the federal government, because there is no way that you would say transmitting those results through beavers, as was promised by INEC, would tamper with the integrity of the results. I am unable to see the logic behind it. But like I have said, let us at this point first, at least, go on with what INEC has said while we wait for the outcome of the election petition tribunal to know what would be proven there and what the courts will hold there.
So there are those who believe this is just a cover, because we do know that INEC, as well as the Minister of Communication and Digital Economy, said that Nigeria and the INEC server itself received millions of attacks from both within and outside Nigeria on February the 25th because of attempts to hack the INEC server. But beyond that, this has not doused some of the atmosphere, some of the tension we have. In fact, it has added fuel to a fire, many would say. What do you think the impact of the minister's statements regarding this would be on those who are contesting the results of the election, on those who are saying that there's just something funny with how everything was done and with how the presidential results were withheld, at least for a certain amount of time until the following morning? What kind of impetus do you think that it gives those who are criticizing the conduct of the elections?
Like I've said, I think it was not a well thought out statement by the minister, and because I really do not see how that in itself would be a justifiable ground for not transmitting as had been promised, without reference to Nigerians that INEC had advised earlier that they were going to transmit electronically through beavers. Now, clearly, that statement is definitely going to incense the supporters of the Labour Party and probably the PDP who lost out in the elections. But whichever way, I think I would go with the advice, again, that look, what's important, let us wait for the outcome of the election petitions tribunal, and let us respect, the process at least. It's immaterial whether at the end of the day one succeeds at the tribunal. There's an avenue to further appeal this one. And like my colleague had said earlier, just like it happened in Ocean, we went all on the way, and at the end of the day, at the Court of Appeal, judgment was that the decision of election petition tribunal, which was upturned, the appeal to the Court of Appeal earlier, was eventually upheld. So what is important that as Nigerians, as patriots, we must be more interested in processes than in our loyalty. It must be more to processes than to people, to parties, because at the end of the day, just like the reference to the American scenario was earlier, because what happened in America, if it had happened in some other states where the systems, where the structures were not strong enough, somebody like President Trump would probably have continued to be in office, probably would have ensured that he no hand over lots of things. But despite all of the tantrums that he threw, the system ensured that he was exited. And so we should be more interested in building the systems, and it is immaterial whether the outcome is favorable to us or not.
All right, Mr. Ologun, I believe you're back with me. Can you confirm that?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've moved on to Lai Mohammed's comments regarding the server, regarding the fact that, according to him, INEC deliberately withheld uploading the presidential election results. But in a situation where we've had the DSS make several warnings in the past 1 to 2 weeks, warnings about those who are attempting to, of course, possibly overthrow Nigeria's government, install an interim government, warnings about hate speech and inciting speech as well, we find that a minister finds himself in the midst of this controversy as someone who's adding more fuel to the fire, accusing a presidential candidate of treason, and then also now directly contradicting INEC's chairman when it comes to the issues around the IRF server. Do we need to see a situation where, even though this is someone who's accounted as being a spokesperson for the president and the administration, or rather the administration, we find our politicians much more succinct and careful and deliberate about what they're saying? Because it feels like from both sides of the divide, opposition or not, we continue to see our politicians use rhetoric and rile up the Nigerians who are caught in the middle of all of this.
Absolutely, I quite agree with that there is a crucial need to exercise caution. Though I read a subsequent report where the minister is denying that he never subscribed to the fact that the INEC chairman intentionally withheld the transfer of the results through the IREF. And I think it's one of the general challenges we have in the country. You know, we've decided to embrace some IT facilities that we did not prepare for or claim to have prepared for, but eventually at the point of experimenting them, we've had a lot of hitches. The same thing is being experienced in the banking industry in trying to push the cashless economy. So we really need, as a nation, to upscale the game. And there were also excuses of attacks directed at the IRA. But we have tested the IT engagement in our elections, particularly this IREF of a thing and the accreditation beavers. Then we just need to improve on this, because the world and the nation and the electorate and the major stakeholders are waiting to witness an election that is credible, free, and fair. And one of the advantages of technology that it helps you with credibility. But then when you talk about the infrastructure of IT, you also talk about the superstructure. And the superstructure is the human element that we manage the IT. And I have said, having studied the Constitution and studied the Electoral Act 2022 as amended, I think we still have some discretion, you know, lined up for INEC. And the National Assembly may proceed to be more specific in the future on what exactly we deserve as a people. Can we then go ahead to say that this must be, you know, because I read those provisions, and then there's even one where a senior still warned terribly before the elections that if INEC is given 7 days to review results, and there is a dangerous provision. So we still need to evaluate some of these provisions against the benchmark of what we experienced around the last general elections and tighten things up. But by and large, I can also say that a lot of surprises came up during these last elections, which may also be connected to the engagement of IT. But there are several complaints, but then there were several surprises. And that's one of the points the Minister of Culture was trying to reiterate, that if a party is claiming to have been sidelined, then why are you also claiming where you have won? So it's neither here nor there. So the politicians must ensure that they play by the games. The umpire, INEC, must ensure that they are trusted by the people. And the electorate also must ensure that we, all come together to ensure that we step up the game of our democracy in the country, because democracy's definition has not changed. It's still the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that is why it's important at this time, and like my colleague has brilliantly mentioned earlier, that please, if there are procedures for ventilating, let us embrace those procedures and be careful the kind of statements that we make. What you consider inciting may incite. It's difficult to draw the line between peace and disorderliness. That's why we believe, and permit me to say this, on the allegations of treason that is being rolled out, if you look at Section 36 of Section 5 of the Nigerian Constitution 1999 as amended, it says that every person who is charged with a criminal offense shall be presumed to be innocent until he is proved guilty. You see, so these are just allegations. And the state also should move beyond the barking dog to biting dog. You want to prosecute, go ahead and prosecute. And it is expected that before you start prosecuting, you have your investigation intact and that you have a committed judiciary. We have the instant case of Ikurimadu in the UK before the prosecution started. There was sufficient investigation and materials were put together in terms of exhibits and witnesses to prosecute that matter. And the whole prosecuted didn't last for more than 6 or 7 weeks. And you saw how that has gone. So we are still hopeful that a clemency will come upon the verdict in that case over there. But then we are talking about sovereignty here. So to what extent the UK will want to allow clemency, it's a different ballgame. We are just advising that we have laws in the land, we should implement these laws, because I look forward to a moment when our elections will not witness the kind of threats that we have seen in recent time, further polarized and everything.
So, Mr. Ologun, you're actually taking me to my next question, because what is it about our elections? What is it about our style of governance that we hold dear here in Nigeria, that almost election cycle after election cycle, whether the normal cycle or off-cycle elections, we seem to find ourselves in similar situations, contested elections, hate speech or inciting comments, accusations of being disloyal and candidates not being patriotic enough, not putting Nigeria before themselves and their political ambitions. It's almost like a rinse and play every 4 years when we have elections. So what is it about Nigeria? Is it our style of government? Is it elections themselves, the way in manner in which we hold elections, or even the players involved that we seem to be repeating? It's deja vu all over almost every single election cycle.
Absolutely. I will hinge it on the style of government and the fact that we are yet to establish the culture of good governance. Let me state this clearly. There was an election in 1964, 1965. In fact, the head of the Federal Electoral Commission resigned then, I think, Kufo Abayori. And right in that First Republic, Action Group and NCNC complained that the election was not credible, but it was a lot of violence sprang up. So it's just about us in the nation. If we have established the culture of service, we won't have all these problems we have. I mean, the presidential election took place in China in March 2023. I doubt if many Nigerians heard about it. And if you look at China, China moved about, some millions of, about 80 million of their citizens out of the poverty bracket. In China, the discussion is about prosperity, not about poverty. We have witnessed what is going on in the UK. You saw how Boris Johnson stepped aside, and then Liz Truss got there, saw the mandate before her, and realized she could not cope because it's service-oriented, and she stepped aside willingly. And now Sunak is there trying to find a way through the woods. So that is where the system has matured. Like I said, it's not just that Donald Trump, the former president of America, is being taken through the mill of criminal justice. Even the sitting president, Joe Biden, had his residence thoroughly searched recently by the state. But there is a system in place. So when we come to the point of accountability, for example, I'm amazed that the total indebtedness of Nigeria stands at about 46 trillion naira. Now it was about 12.12 trillion naira in 2015. Is anyone accountable for that?
Yeah.
So when we come to the point of accountability, it should reflect in our elections. And we look forward to that season. And for now, and that's why we look forward also to the National Assembly. I think what we are having now is because there are some loopholes in our laws. We need to tighten these laws to facilitate the core principles of good governance. And accountability is critical there, service to the people. And these are issues. And in the absence of establishing the culture of respecting the rule of law, people will want to ride on the eyes of the law. And it should not be allowed in any way. And that is why you see people making different kinds of inflammable, highly inflammable statements and things like that. No, you should be subject to the laws of the land. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you are the president. The president may enjoy immunity from criminal prosecution, but he should not enjoy immunity from not delivering good service to the people. So these are issues. So we are yet to arrive at the point of engaging our resources resourcefully to create commonwealth for common good. That is why our elections are still witnessing these desperate approaches, different kinds of complaints.
Okay. Mr. Ajare, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, because Mr. Ologun has laid it at the style of government that we haven't been able to establish a culture of credibility. But it gets tiring, I can tell you, as a journalist who's covered multiple elections in Nigeria, also being able to cover elections outside of the country. It's tiring as a Nigerian, cycle after cycle, 4 years after 4 years, that we can't simply go to the polls to vote, bring in a new government, whether we voted for them or not, and move on with our lives. We seem to find ourselves enmeshed in months of these controversies, day after day, time after time, and it doesn't seem to be any different. And we're already talking about 2027. So is it our style of government? Is it elections? Or do we need to start having a conversation about whether or not this type of democracy is really for Nigeria?
I don't know really if I would put it on the style of government. The presidential system is not only practiced in Nigeria, it's practiced in other places around the world. And I mean, it's been successful in some, at least to a large extent, in many of these countries. I think I would want to put the problem, I would want to put the blame for the manner our elections are organized and executed on us as a people, our attitude towards even the democratic experience. Plus, of course, I would want to also say that our attitude is probably also influenced by several years of military intrusion into the democratic space that has damaged the psyche of the average Nigerians and is gradually being transferred into even the younger people. It's clearly an attitudinal problem. First, it starts from when you call people to come and register as voters first, it's a problem. Then eventually, when the elections themselves come, the turnout of voters is always amazing. Sometimes you get 1/5 of total registered voters coming out to vote. And meanwhile, it is not even all qualified persons that are registered. Then, when you now also see, when you talk about vote buying, you also wonder why people would sell their votes for things as little as salt, sachet of spaghetti, and things that little. Yes, clearly there's poverty. Yes, clearly there's dependency. But I don't think really that Nigeria, it ought to be so. So it is really our attitude as citizens, the attitude of politicians, the attitude of the umpires, the people, of course, who make up the Independent National Electoral Commission, or by whatever name it is called at any point in time. Now, it is these people who make up these systems, and because some persons benefit from the lack of organization that you have on ground, these people infiltrate the system and ensure that they perpetuate this lack of organization. So from this year, you can be sure that there are people who are already scheming towards how to hijack the next election. They are already scheming on how to put their people in INEC. They are already scheming on seeing how to put their people at the state independent electoral commissions. They are already scheming So a lot of these things boil down to our attitudes at the end of the day. And of course, it still go back to the issue of accountability. Because there is no accountability in the system, people are able to continue to do this thing. And so for instance, you have so many people who were involved in electoral malpractices in the last election. And yes, I understand that, about 20-something or 30-something people are said to be arraigned or have been arraigned. But when you look at them, you will find that, look, none of these people, at the end of the day, are the key actors in the entire process.
Yes.
Meanwhile, those key actors are there, and they're not going. So when those key actors are able to go through, and then you pick the small fishes, and then you try them, and then they get slaps on their wrist, or probably eventually people get acquitted at the end of the day because people are able to get things done. At the end of the day, certainly it is going to happen again in the next election. But if you can institute accountability, make sure that those who disrupt the election, those who manipulate the system, those who violate the laws, any part or portion of the electoral laws in the process, are made to account for it. You're going to certainly find an increased and improved level of compliance in subsequent elections.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to end the conversation here because of time, but it is one that will be following very closely because of the weight of the accusations that have been made and, of course, the tension and sensitivity of the time that Nigeria finds itself in right now. Deji Ajare, Executive Director at the Sterling Law Center, and legal practitioner and public affairs analyst Jide Ologun, thank you so much for joining me on Politics HQ.
Thank you, too. God bless Nigeria.
Thank you so much for having me.
And while many of us are still caught up in dealing with the aftermath of the February 25th and March 18th elections, looking at the election petition tribunals, the sentiments, and of course the divisions that seem to have been amplified, there are those who already have their eyes on the prize of 2027. But many would also say that this is a time Nigeria must invest in introspection and self-reflection if we do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. The past is not so far ago, and it's a past that will continue to be in our present as we find and follow the cases around the election results and, of course, accusations, controversies, and the comments that come up in the aftermath. We will follow all of them very closely as we detail all of what's happening in the political scene here in Nigeria, Africa's largest economy and the most populous black nation on earth, right here on Politics HQ. This is where we draw the curtain for tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to follow us on social media at News Central TV. Share your thoughts on the conversations and let us know what you're talking about as it concerns politics here in Nigeria. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Do have a pleasant evening.